Some heroes save lives with medicine, others with courage under fire. But in a Mexican wheat field in the 1960s, an agronomist saved lives with seeds. Norman Borlaug bent down to examine stalks of a new wheat variety, short and sturdy plants that would revolutionize agriculture and feed over 1 billion people. The dwarf wheat he had spent decades developing could support heavy grain heads without toppling, yielding 2 to 3 times more food than traditional varieties. While experts predicted mass starvation across Asia as populations outpaced food production, Borlaug offered a different future. His innovation seemed simple, crossing wheat strains to create better plants. But the journey from an Iowa farm to these Mexican fields had required relentless persistence, unorthodox methods, and faith that science could solve humanity's oldest problem. The seeds in his hands contained the answer to famine predictions that haunted demographers and politicians. Within years, these varieties would transform India and Pakistan from food importers to self-sufficient nations, preventing catastrophe that would have killed millions. The wheat that changed everything grew from soil and science, patience and conviction. Norman Ernest Borlaug was born on the 25th of March, 1914, on a small farm near Cresco, Iowa. His parents, Henry and Clara Borlaug, were children of Norwegian immigrants who had settled in the rural Midwest seeking opportunity through hard work and land ownership. The farm was modest, producing enough to support the family but offering little luxury. Norman grew up understanding that farming meant constant labor, uncertain outcomes, and dependence on weather beyond human control. His childhood revolved around agricultural rhythms: spring planting, summer cultivation, fall harvest, winter preparation for the next cycle. Norman worked alongside his father and grandfather, learning to plow fields, plant seeds, tend crops, and pray that rain and sunshine would arrive in proper measure. The work was physical and demanding, teaching lessons about persistence and the gap between effort and reward. Some years brought abundant harvests. Others brought disappointment when weather or pests destroyed crops. The Depression hit rural Iowa hard. Agricultural prices collapsed, making it difficult for small farmers to earn enough to survive. The Borlaug family weathered the economic crisis better than some neighbors, but Norman witnessed foreclosures, families losing farms, and the desperation that accompanied economic catastrophe. The experience instilled understanding that hunger and poverty weren't distant abstractions, but immediate threats that could destroy communities. Norman's grandfather Nels delivered advice that would shape his future. Nels Borlaug, himself an immigrant who had struggled to establish himself in America, told young Norman that education was the path to security and opportunity. The exact words became family legend. "You are wiser to fill your head now if you want to fill your belly later." The message was clear. Physical labor was honorable, but limiting. Education opened possibilities that farming alone could not provide. Norman attended a one-room schoolhouse where a single teacher instructed children of all ages. The education was basic but adequate, providing reading, writing, arithmetic, and enough foundation for those who would continue studying. Many rural children ended their education after 8th grade, returning to farm work full-time. Norman nearly followed this pattern, uncertain whether continuing to high school was practical given his family's financial situation. A high school wrestling coach named Dave Bartelma saw potential in the young farm boy and encouraged him to continue his education. Bartelma offered mentorship and support, helping Norman understand that college was possible even for someone from a modest farming background. The encouragement proved decisive. Norman enrolled at the University of Minnesota in 1933, determined to pursue higher education despite limited finances. College meant working constantly to afford tuition and living expenses. Norman took jobs waiting tables, serving as a dormitory proctor, and doing any work that would earn money for school. He studied forestry initially, drawn to outdoor work that combined science with practical application. The university exposed him to possibilities beyond the Iowa farm, introducing him to professors' ideas and opportunities that would eventually lead to Mexico and wheat fields, half a world away from Cresco. At the University of Minnesota, Norman Borlaug discovered that science could address the agricultural uncertainties that had defined his childhood. His initial focus on forestry shifted when he encountered Elvin Charles Stackman, a professor whose work on plant pathology opened new intellectual territory. Stackman studied plant diseases, particularly wheat stem rust, a fungal infection that could destroy entire harvests. The professor's research demonstrated that crop failures weren't simply acts of God but had biological causes that science could understand and potentially prevent. Stackman became Borlaug's mentor, recognizing the young man's combination of practical farming knowledge and intellectual capability. Under Stackman's guidance, Borlaug shifted his focus to plant pathology, studying the diseases that devastated crops worldwide. The work appealed to both his scientific curiosity and his farm-bred understanding of agriculture's importance. Crop diseases caused famines, killed thousands through starvation, and destroyed the economic foundation of rural communities. Solving these problems could save lives and livelihoods. Borlaug pursued graduate studies in plant pathology, earning his Ph.D. in 1942. His dissertation focused on wheat stem rust, examining the fungus's biology and exploring methods for controlling its spread. The research was technically sophisticated, but motivated by practical concerns. How could farmers protect their wheat crops from diseases that could wipe out entire harvests? During his university years, Norman married Margaret Gibson, beginning a partnership that would last over 6 decades. Margaret supported his academic pursuits, understanding that his commitment to agricultural science meant an uncertain career path focused more on mission than income. The marriage provided stability and companionship as Norman navigated the transition from farm boy to scientist. The 1940 context shaped Borlaug's emerging career. World War II created food shortages and demonstrated agriculture's strategic importance. Nations that couldn't feed themselves faced vulnerability and dependence. The war effort required increased agricultural production to feed both military forces and civilian populations. Scientists with expertise in crop improvement and disease control became valuable contributors to national security. After completing his doctorate, Borlaug worked briefly for DuPont in industrial microbiology, applying scientific knowledge to commercial problems. The work was interesting and well paid, but didn't satisfy his deeper motivation to address hunger and agricultural challenges in a more direct way. He was a scientist with farming roots, someone who understood both the laboratory and the field, and he wanted work that combined both dimensions. In 1944, opportunity arrived in an unexpected form. The Rockefeller Foundation had established a Mexican agricultural program aimed at addressing Mexico's food security problems. The program needed scientists willing to work in challenging conditions, breeding improved crop varieties in actual fields rather than controlled research stations. The position offered modest pay, primitive working conditions, and the chance to apply scientific knowledge to urgent practical problems for Borlaug. The choice was obvious. He accepted the position and moved to Mexico, beginning a journey that would consume the rest of his life. Mexico in the 1940s faced a food crisis. The nation imported substantial portions of its wheat supply, creating economic strain and food insecurity. Wheat stem rust and other diseases regularly devastated Mexican crops, reducing yields and increasing dependence on foreign grain. The Rockefeller Foundation's Mexican agricultural program, established in 1943, aimed to address these problems through agricultural research and improved farming practices. Norman Borlaug arrived in 1944 to find working conditions far removed from university research facilities. There was no laboratory, limited equipment, and expectations that research would happen in fields under agricultural conditions rather than in controlled environments. Some scientists would have found the primitive setup discouraging. Borlaug, who had grown up working Iowa soil, felt comfortable combining scientific rigor with practical farming. His assignment was straightforward but daunting, develop wheat varieties that could resist stem rust and other diseases while producing higher yields. The challenge required breeding new wheat strains by crossing different varieties, then testing the offspring under various conditions to identify plants with desired characteristics. Traditional plant breeding was slow, requiring years to develop and evaluate new varieties. Borlaug implemented an approach that became known as shuttle breeding. Rather than growing wheat in a single location and waiting for one harvest per year, he moved his experimental crops between different elevations and climate zones. By planting in the Yaqui Valley in northwestern Mexico during winter and in the higher elevation Toluca Valley during summer, he could grow 2 wheat crops annually. This shuttle breeding accelerated the development process, allowing him to test more generations in less time. The methodology was unorthodox and attracted skepticism from colleagues who questioned whether plants bred in this manner would perform reliably. Conventional wisdom held that wheat varieties needed to be carefully adapted to specific locations and photoperiods. Borlaug's approach of breeding in multiple environments seemed likely to produce plants that wouldn't perform well anywhere. He ignored the skepticism and continued his work, convinced that wheat bred to succeed in diverse conditions would prove more adaptable and resilient. The work was physically demanding and intellectually challenging. Borlaug spent long days in fields, hand-pollinating wheat plants, carefully crossing varieties with desired traits, and maintaining detailed records of thousands of breeding lines. He worked in heat and dust, suffered from wheat allergies that made him miserable during pollination season, and endured the frustration of breeding lines that showed promise only to fail when tested under different conditions. Years passed with incremental progress. Some varieties showed improved disease resistance. Others produced higher yields, but combining all desired traits into a single superior variety proved elusive. Borlaug continued methodically crossing wheat strains, testing offspring, selecting the best performers and crossing them again. The work required patience, systematic record-keeping, and faith that persistence would eventually produce breakthrough. By the late 1940 and early 1950, Borlaug had developed wheat varieties with significantly improved stem rust resistance. Mexican wheat production increased as farmers adopted the new varieties. Mexico's wheat imports decreased as domestic production improved. The success validated the agricultural program and demonstrated that applied science could address food security challenges. But the greatest breakthrough was still ahead. Traditional wheat faced a fundamental problem that limited yield improvements. When breeders developed varieties that produced more grain, the plants grew taller to support the additional seed heads. But tall wheat plants were structurally weak. When loaded with heavy grain, they toppled over in wind or rain, a condition called lodging. Once wheat lodged, it was difficult to harvest, and much of the crop was lost. The lodging problem created a ceiling on wheat yields that conventional breeding couldn't overcome. Borlaug's breakthrough came from crossing his Mexican wheat varieties with Japanese dwarf wheat strains. The Japanese varieties, including one called Norin 10, grew to about half the height of conventional wheat due to specific genetic traits that limited stem elongation. When Borlaug crossed tall Mexican wheat with these dwarf varieties, he created semi-dwarf hybrids that combined the grain production of improved varieties with the sturdy structure of short plants. The semi-dwarf wheat could support heavy grain heads without lodging. The plants invested less energy in producing tall stalks and more in producing grain. They responded better to fertilizer applications, which caused conventional wheat to grow even taller and more prone to lodging, but simply increased grain production in dwarf varieties. The yield improvements were dramatic, 2 to 3 times higher than traditional wheat in optimal conditions. The new varieties also demonstrated disease resistance that Borlaug had bred into them over years of selection. They matured quickly, performed well in diverse climates, and adapted to different growing conditions because of the shuttle breeding approach. The combination of characteristics created wheat varieties that were genuinely revolutionary in their potential impact on food production. Mexico provided the first proof of concept. Farmers who planted the new varieties experienced dramatic yield increases. Word spread quickly through agricultural communities as farmers compared results. Mexican wheat production surged as more farmers adopted the improved varieties. By the early 1960s, Mexico had transitioned from wheat importer to self-sufficient nation, and eventually to wheat exporter. The transformation took less than 2 decades from the start of Borlaug's work. The success excited Borlaug and his colleagues, but also created new questions. The varieties had succeeded in Mexico, but would they perform in other countries with different climates, soils, and agricultural practices? Could the approach that worked in one nation be replicated elsewhere? The questions were urgent because other regions, particularly South Asia, faced food crises far more severe than Mexico's had been. Borlaug began to envision wheat improvement as a global project rather than a Mexican program. He understood that the semi-dwarf varieties could address hunger beyond Mexico if they could be adapted to other regions, and if governments and farmers were willing to adopt new approaches. The stage was set for testing whether one scientist's work in Mexican fields could prevent famines half a world away. By the mid-1960s, demographers were predicting catastrophic famines in South Asia. India and Pakistan's populations were growing faster than their food production. Both nations depended on grain imports to feed their people, creating economic strain and food insecurity. Experts forecast that mass starvation was inevitable, with millions likely to die in the coming decade. The predictions seemed well-founded given historical patterns and current trends. Agricultural officials from Pakistan and India learned about Borlaug's work in Mexico and wondered whether his wheat varieties could help address their nation's food crises. Initial contacts led to Borlaug visiting South Asia to assess conditions and possibilities. What he found was both challenging and promising. The agricultural practices were traditional, yields were low, and infrastructure was limited. But the climate in Punjab regions of both countries was suitable for wheat cultivation, and farmers were desperate for solutions that could increase food production. Resistance to adopting foreign crop varieties was substantial. Cultural pride made some officials skeptical of accepting agricultural solutions from outside. Political tensions between India and Pakistan complicated coordination. Some agronomists questioned whether varieties developed in Mexico could succeed in South Asian conditions. Bureaucratic obstacles slowed decision-making. Borlaug encountered frustration at every level as he tried to convince officials to try his wheat varieties. The 1965 crisis forced action. Food shortages were becoming critical, and both nations faced the immediate threat of widespread hunger. Officials authorized importing seed from Mexico for trial plantings. The logistical challenges were enormous. Shipping 18,000 tons of seed required extensive coordination. Then the India-Pakistan War of 1965 broke out, threatening to derail the entire project. Borlaug personally intervened to ensure that seed shipments continued, despite the conflict, arguing that hunger killed more people than wars, and that both nations needed the wheat regardless of their political disputes. The first harvests exceeded all expectations. Farmers who planted the Mexican wheat varieties saw yields double or triple compared to traditional varieties. The results were so dramatic that skepticism transformed into enthusiasm. Demand for the new seed exploded as farmers recognized that the improved varieties offered escape from poverty and hunger. The Punjab regions of both Pakistan and India became focal points for rapid agricultural transformation. Borlaug spent extensive time in South Asia during this period, traveling to fields, training agronomists, and troubleshooting problems. He worked with farmers directly, demonstrating proper planting techniques and fertilizer applications. He trained local scientists who could continue the work after he returned to Mexico. He pushed governments to invest in agricultural infrastructure, including irrigation systems and fertilizer production facilities, needed to support the new varieties. Within a few years, wheat production in both countries increased dramatically. The famines that experts had predicted as inevitable did not occur. Instead, Pakistan and India moved toward food self-sufficiency, reducing dependence on imports, and building agricultural capacity that could feed their growing populations. The transformation was so rapid and significant that observers began calling it the Green Revolution. The success in Pakistan and India demonstrated that Borlaug's wheat varieties and agricultural methods could be replicated globally. Nations throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America sought to adopt the Green Revolution approaches that had prevented South Asian famines. International agricultural organizations mobilized to spread improved crop varieties and training programs to developing nations worldwide. The statistics told a story of transformation that was almost incomprehensible in its scale and speed. India's wheat production increased from 12 million tons in 1965 to 20 million tons by 1970, a 67% increase in just 5 years. Pakistan experienced similar growth. Both nations transitioned from chronic food deficit to food security in less than a decade. The wheat revolution spread to other crops as rice breeders in the Philippines and elsewhere developed high-yield varieties following similar principles. Borlaug and his colleagues established training programs that brought agronomists from developing nations to Mexico and other research centers. Thousands of agricultural scientists learned modern breeding techniques, disease management, and crop improvement methods. These trained agronomists returned to their home countries and spread the knowledge further, creating a multiplication effect that extended the Green Revolution's reach far beyond what Borlaug could accomplish personally. International agricultural research centers emerged to coordinate and expand the work. The International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Mexico, where Borlaug was based, became a hub for wheat research. The International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines focused on rice improvement. Similar institutions were established for other crops and regions. These centers created a global network of scientists working on food security challenges, sharing research and accelerating progress. Countries that had been chronic food importers became exporters. The economic and political implications were profound. Nations gained food sovereignty, reducing vulnerability to international markets and political pressure. Agricultural productivity improvements freed resources for industrial development and education. The Green Revolution contributed to economic growth throughout the developing world by solving the fundamental problem of food production. The transformation wasn't uniform across all regions. Africa saw more limited adoption of Green Revolution technologies due to different crops, more diverse growing conditions, and limited infrastructure. But even in regions where success was partial, the demonstrated possibility that science could dramatically increase food production influenced agricultural policy and research priorities. By the 1970s, it was clear that Borlaug's work had prevented the mass famines that demographers had predicted as inevitable. Estimates suggested that without the yield improvements from new wheat and rice varieties, hundreds of millions of people would have faced starvation. The actual number of lives saved was difficult to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggested that the Green Revolution had prevented famine-related deaths for hundreds of millions of people, with some estimates reaching over 1 billion lives saved. The recognition that agricultural science had accomplished this transformation without war, without massive foreign aid programs, and primarily through the patient work of plant breeders who developed better crop varieties was almost shocking in its implications. It demonstrated that practical science applied to urgent problems could achieve results that political or military solutions could not. Success at the scale of the Green Revolution inevitably attracted criticism alongside praise. Environmental advocates raised concerns about the ecological costs of high-yield agriculture. The new wheat varieties required substantial fertilizer and water inputs to achieve their potential yields. Increased fertilizer use meant more chemical production and application, with associated environmental impacts, including water pollution and soil degradation. The emphasis on a few high-yield varieties created monocultures that reduced agricultural biodiversity. Pesticide use increased as farmers sought to protect valuable high-yield crops from insects and diseases. Critics worried about pesticide impacts on ecosystems and human health. The industrial agriculture model that accompanied the Green Revolution seemed to replicate problems that environmentalists were identifying in developed nations' agricultural systems. Social critics argued that the Green Revolution benefited wealthy farmers while harming poor farmers and landless laborers. Farmers with capital to invest in seeds, fertilizers, and irrigation equipment profited from the new technologies. Poor farmers who couldn't afford these inputs found themselves at a competitive disadvantage. The rapid agricultural change disrupted traditional farming communities and social structures. Some rural workers lost employment as mechanization accompanied the shift to more intensive agriculture. Questions about long-term sustainability of Green Revolution agriculture intensified as decades passed. Were the yield improvements maintainable, or would soil degradation, water depletion, and pest resistance eventually undermine productivity? Critics contended that the Green Revolution had solved immediate hunger problems, but created longer-term environmental and social problems that would require addressing. Borlaug acknowledged these concerns but defended his work with moral clarity. He argued that preventing mass starvation was a more urgent priority than environmental concerns, however legitimate. People who were starving didn't have the luxury of worrying about long-term sustainability. They needed food immediately, and the Green Revolution had provided it. He pointed out that environmental critics typically lived in wealthy nations where food security was assured, giving them the privilege of worrying about agricultural methods rather than agricultural output. His response to critics was nuanced rather than dismissive. He recognized that the Green Revolution had costs and limitations. He advocated for continued research to address environmental concerns and improve sustainability. He supported work on integrated pest management, soil conservation, and more efficient fertilizer use. But he refused to accept the implication that it would have been better to allow millions to starve rather than adopt imperfect agricultural solutions. Borlaug also argued that population growth, not agricultural methods, was the fundamental challenge facing humanity. The Green Revolution had bought time by increasing food production, but that time needed to be used to address population growth and resource consumption. He warned that no agricultural technology could support infinite population growth on a finite planet. The success of the Green Revolution created responsibility to address underlying demographic and resource challenges. The controversies never resolved into clear consensus. The Green Revolution remained simultaneously celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements and criticized for its environmental and social costs. Borlaug's response was characteristic. Continue working on improvements while maintaining focus on the primary goal of feeding people. On the 20th of October 1970, Norman Borlaug was working in Mexican wheat fields when he received news that he had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The announcement surprised him. The Peace Prize typically recognized political leaders, peace negotiators, or humanitarian activists. Recognizing an agricultural scientist was unprecedented. The Norwegian Nobel Committee citation praised Borlaug for contributions to world peace through increasing food supply, arguing that hunger created conflict and that solving food security problems contributed fundamentally to peace. The recognition validated Borlaug's life work and brought international attention to agricultural science's role in addressing human welfare. His Nobel lecture in Oslo emphasized themes he had developed throughout his career. He spoke about population growth's challenge, warning that agricultural improvements alone couldn't solve hunger if populations continued growing unsustainably. He discussed the relationship between food security and peace, arguing that nations confident in their ability to feed their populations were less likely to engage in conflict than nations facing starvation. The Nobel Prize brought a flood of additional recognition. Borlaug received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from the United States, the Congressional Gold Medal, and dozens of honorary doctorates from universities worldwide. He was inducted into national academies of science, received awards from agricultural organizations, and became recognized globally as the father of the Green Revolution. Despite the recognition, Borlaug's lifestyle changed little. He continued working in fields, breeding wheat varieties, and training young scientists. The awards and ceremonies were obligations he fulfilled, but his real commitment remained to practical agricultural science rather than public recognition. Colleagues who worked with him after his Nobel Prize reported that he remained the same demanding, dedicated researcher he had been before fame arrived. Borlaug established the World Food Prize in 1986 to recognize others working on food security challenges. The prize, modeled on the Nobel Prize but focused specifically on agriculture and hunger, provided a platform for highlighting continued work on feeding the world's population. Borlaug used his prominence to advocate for agricultural research funding, arguing that the Green Revolution's success should inspire continued investment rather than complacency. He remained professionally active well into his 90s, advising on agricultural projects, mentoring young scientists, and advocating for food security policies. His continued work reflected his conviction that fighting hunger was a permanent mission, rather than a problem solved by a single breakthrough. Each generation faced agricultural challenges that required dedicated scientific work to address. Borlaug's later years included advocacy for biotechnology and genetically modified crops. He argued that new technologies offered possibilities for further yield improvements and enhanced nutrition. His support for GMOs attracted new controversy, but his position was consistent with his career-long commitment to using science to increase food production. He viewed opposition to agricultural biotechnology as potentially dangerous to food security, particularly for developing nations. The recognition that accompanied Borlaug's work never translated to celebrity in the traditional sense. He remained largely unknown to the general public, even as agricultural scientists and food security experts regarded him as one of the most important figures of the 20th century. The contrast between his impact and his fame was striking. A scientist who saved more lives than perhaps any other person in history remained obscure to most people in developed nations who benefited indirectly from the food security his work had created. Norman Borlaug died on the 12th of September, 2009, at age 95, having dedicated 7 decades to fighting hunger. Estimates suggest his work saved between 250 million and over 1 billion lives, making him arguably the single human who saved the most lives in history. The number represents entire nations' worth of people who lived because wheat yields increased dramatically across the developing world. His legacy remains complex. The Green Revolution undeniably prevented mass famines and transformed developing nations from food importers to self-sufficient producers. But environmental costs and sustainability questions that critics raised were legitimate concerns requiring continued attention. Climate change and population growth present new challenges that test whether the Green Revolution's lessons remain relevant. The next agricultural revolution must build on Borlaug's legacy while addressing industrial agriculture's limitations. The Iowa farm boy who became the man who fed the world demonstrated that one person's dedication to solving practical problems could transform human history. His life wasn't characterized by dramatic moments, but by patient, systematic work conducted over decades, crossing wheat plants and recording results thousands of times until breakthrough emerged. His story challenges assumptions about heroism and impact. Borlaug achieved more than most military leaders or political figures, yet remained largely unknown outside agricultural science. His work saved lives not through dramatic intervention, but through incremental improvements that accumulated into transformation. The legacy he left isn't measured in fame, but in the simple fact that billions of people are alive today because one scientist refused to accept hunger as inevitable.